preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Good evening. My name is John Rosenthal. I'm the president of the 92nd Street Y, and we welcome you for this evening's lecture. Tonight is the 5th annual Goldberg Distinguished Lectureship. This lecture was founded in 1984 by Bernard Goldberg in memory of his wife, Monica Dennis Goldberg. The forming idea of this unique occasion has been to invite a woman of extraordinary intellectual distinction and achievement to speak on a topic of current concern in the world of ideas. It is a forum which we at the 92nd Street Y are proud to call our own each year, a high point of the discourse on our stages. In an unusual confluence of events, tonight's moderator, Dr. Claire Gaudiani, was a classmate and friend of Monica Goldberg's at Connecticut College. Today, Claire Gaudiani is the president of Connecticut College, and it is she who will introduce this evening's speaker, Mrs. Katharine Graham, Chief Executive Officer of the Washington Post Company. But first, a word about Dr. Gaudiani. Before coming to her post at Connecticut College, she was a senior fellow in Romance Languages at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of 3 books, with a 4th just coming out. She has also written more than 40 articles on 17th century French poetry, the learning of languages, teaching in the humanities, and management in higher education, a scholar and humanist of the first rank. At the end of the address, the index cards that you should have been handed upon entering the auditorium will be collected by the ushers. If you will, write your questions as legibly as possible. It is with great pleasure that I welcome as tonight's moderator, Dr. Claire Gaudiani.
Good evening. Katharine Graham and I met to talk about tonight several weeks ago when I was in Washington. I arrived at her Georgetown home in the earliest stages of a morning snowfall. We began by discussing issues related to her topic for tonight, accountability and the press in America. I agreed not to begin my introduction of her in the usual orderly, even tedious way by mentioning that she attended Vassar and graduated from the University of Chicago and began her career as a reporter for the San Francisco News, nor that she and her husband, Philip, publisher of the Washington Post from '46 until his death in '63, had raised 4 children. This, we decided, everyone already knew. As we talked, though, I tried to frame my introduction in my mind. I tried to imagine how I would proceed if I were deprived of my usual resume format that academics are accustomed to. I thought to myself, I will focus on her as a risk taker. Aloud, I asked her about the moment when she alone had to decide whether or not to publish the Pentagon Papers. Well, she said, I hate risk. That moment was a terrible one, and I avoid risk at all times. But I had to make a decision, and so I did, right there on the telephone in the next room. Well, I thought, never mind, I will describe her as a manager, a great manager of people and ideas. How do you approach, I ventured, the complex set of responsibilities as manager of a whole set of companies, each with different needs and different trajectories of development? I delegate a lot, Katharine Graham replied. I have excellent people around me, and we work well together. Good people need autonomy. As I was scrambling for another angle, Katharine Graham began to talk about a newly focused concern of hers, which I happen to also share. And we charged into a lengthy discussion on the problems in America's urban schools. Clearly more comfortable no longer talking about herself, she became at once the reporter, the mother, the manager, the ideal responsible citizen. It was easy to see the asset she must be to the various boards she serves on, trustee of the Urban Institute and member of the Senior Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics at Harvard and the Council on Foreign Relations, among others. As we spoke, I began to see Mrs. Graham as a person of contrast, a private person who has conscientiously maintained a low profile in public, and yet a chairman and CEO of a set of the nation's most successful media. The Washington Post company, which owns the Washington Post and Newsweek and 4 TV stations in 4 major cities, as well as the Post Newsweek cable, among other companies. Katharine Graham is also a woman of contrast because she's frequently called one of the country's best managers. Revenues have doubled since 1980, and profits have quadrupled. The Post's president and COO, Richard Simmons, calls her management style patient opportunism. But Katharine Graham's training for management followed an unusual route. After early jobs and raising her children, she began her professional career at age 46, I remembered. And she has since built the company she took over into one of the nation's best managed companies, as judged in Business Month magazine recently. Business Month credited specifically her management style and team as the source of that achievement. She works hard to develop executive talent, and she succeeds, said Business Month. As we talked about urban schools, and I was calculating the contrasts in her life, it was she who suddenly realized that 2 hours had passed and several more inches of snow had fallen, and I was about to be late for my presentation at the American Association of Colleges meeting in the city. "We'll never get a cab to come out here," she said, "so I'll just drive you in." Before I could object, the person many call America's most powerful woman had found me a pair of knee-high Santa boots to replace my 3-inch slingbacks, and had broom in hand and was standing at the door ready to clear the snow off her car and set off downtown to the hotel where I was to speak. On the way in, we watched other cars skidding and spinning, and Katharine Graham drove peacefully and confidently along. And I thought to myself, I had been right. Katharine Graham is a risk taker. But she was also right, because when there was a decision to make, she made it. And when there was a job to be done, she did it, and she did it very well. I'm delighted to present the Goldberg Lecturer for this evening, an exceptional American woman. Join me in welcoming Katharine Graham.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire. That was a terribly nice introduction. And I appreciate your kindness and all the effort you took to come and see me to make an introduction. I've never had anybody introduce you before and try to get to know you and take all that trouble. And I think it's wonderful. Thank you. It's a great honor to have been invited to give this 4th annual Goldberg Lecture. The list of my predecessors, Jihan Sadat, Hannah Gray, and Helen Sussman, is as intimidating as it is inspiring. I feel as though my greatest contribution tonight will be to give next year's speaker an easier act to follow. The choice of what to say to a group of people whose occupations and avocations are very different, yet who share a common interest in social, cultural, and political issues, has led me to a central question involving people and the press. The question is this: what is the accountability of the media in the United States? I admit even the concept of accountability would amuse many of our critics. Who elected the press is their frequent complaint. And they observe, quite rightly, that anyone with a Xerox machine can publish just about anything in the United States, short of libel, narrowly defined. The media are subject to no clearly defined professional standards, no code of ethics, nor even, in the case of print, to the government licenses required of many professions, from cosmeticians to tree surgeons. This is precisely what the framers of our Constitution had in mind. They gave extraordinary freedoms to the press so it could be an adversarial critic and commentator, not only of the government, but of all other institutions and events in our society. Our founding fathers recognized that the free flow of information and the clash of ideas are essential to democracy. Over the years, the freedom of the press have often been challenged. But protected by the courts and by the will of our people, these freedoms have endured. Does this mean that we in the media are truly unaccountable? Not really. We have many responsibilities to our readers and viewers, the people and institutions on whom we report and comment, our advertisers, our shareholders, and our employees. Our obligations to these constituencies are complex and changing. Frequently they conflict, posing difficult questions about what we owe to whom. In a very real sense, my major responsibility as Chief Executive Officer of the Washington Post Company is balancing these conflicting responsibilities. As Claire mentioned, let me give you a famous and dramatic illustration of what she referred to, the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. As you will recall, the Pentagon Papers were a detailed history of the Vietnam War, commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to analyze what really happened, but they were marked top secret. They provided new, startling information about the government's conduct of the war. Some of it was embarrassing. Only a few paragraphs in a large number of volumes were really sensitive, and those paragraphs were never considered for publication. The Pentagon Papers were first handed, as you may remember, to the New York Times by Daniel Ellsberg, a former Pentagon staff member with a top secret clearance, who was an opponent of the war. The Times began to publish the excerpts and summaries on June 13th of that year. The government, claiming national security interests, immediately went to court to obtain an order that would prohibit the Times from printing any further excerpts. The Post, meanwhile, was trying frantically to obtain its own copy of the documents. Ben Bradley, executive editor of the Post, said that every line of the Times report was written in his blood. 4 days later, we succeeded, and a team of writers and editors worked furiously all day to prepare our own story. But the decision to print the Pentagon Papers raised enormous conflict. Our editors believed our readers had a right and a need to know this important new information about an event that was dividing the country. The government argued that publication would seriously damage national security. Our lawyers and business managers were very concerned about our legal position, even more vulnerable, they thought, because the Times had by now been enjoined from publication. To top it off, our company was just at that moment in the process of going public. Our stock had been offered to the underwriters, but had not yet been sold. If we became the target of legal action, possibly criminal liability, the whole deal would have gone down the drain, jeopardizing the very foundation of our company. At that time, I was publisher of the Post and president of the company. In the middle of a party at my home for the Post's circulation director, who was retiring that day, I got a telephone call right in the middle of a toast from Ben Bradley's house, where for secrecy's sake, writers, editors, and lawyers had repaired, and where, unbeknownst to me, they had reached a deadlock about whether or not to publish. We had never dreamt that could happen. As they called, the presses had been held for some time with 2 or 3 or 4 promotion ads where the stories were going to go, and a decision had to be made instantly. All the writers and editors got on the phone, one by one, imploring me to go ahead. The lawyers said, don't. And the business people said, take your time. Fritz Beebe, who was chairman of the company and a former Cravath partner, said that he probably would not go ahead. But somehow he very subtly left the door open for me to say, let's publish, if I thought it was the right thing to do. So it really had to be instinctive, and my instinct said, let's go. We did, without missing a single day after the Times was enjoined. We all considered it really important not to skip a day. The Times and we later won the Supreme Court case against prior restraint. But it was a very mixed decision, almost a Pyrrhic victory in some ways, but a victory nonetheless. Well, very few cases are as dramatic as that one, but the conflicts are still with us. Here's how I view our obligations to the various publics we serve. Let's start on the business side. The advertisers and shareholders without whom we couldn't exist. It often comes as a surprise, particularly to foreigners, that the media in the United States are essentially commercial ventures. I don't view this as a liability. On the contrary, I view our capitalist foundation as one of our greatest strengths. Financial success provides the dollars needed to ensure quality, and financial success provides the independence the press needs to pursue the news without fear or favor. It can be quite costly. Take Watergate. When the Washington Post was reporting the Watergate story, the Nixon administration attempted to intimidate us by, among other things, bringing about challenges to our 2 Florida television station licenses. That caused our stock to plummet and cost over $1 million to defend. I'd remind you that $1 million in those days was a lot more money, and we were a smaller company. But an organization with fewer financial resources could not have paid this price. It also probably would have been harder without family control, but still possible, I believe. An organization that depended on government subsidies, though, in one form or another, would have been under severe pressure to abandon the story. So our existence and independence depends on meeting the needs of enough people who are willing to pay for our survival with their hard-earned dollars. We also have to deliver to our advertisers an audience of potential buyers for their products. Obviously, not every publication or television program can produce the right audience for every product. Fortunately, I believe that quality publications and programming can attract the kind of audiences that many advertisers want. By quality, I don't mean highbrow or esoteric publications for the elite. I also don't see journalism as a sort of Sunday school or sermon constantly telling people what they should find interesting, whether they do or not. Rather, I mean fresh thinking, aggressive reporting, a diversity of voices, and lively non-formula writing for a mass of people. In other words, producing a paper or magazine that people need and want to read, even if they sometimes get angry with what you report, is the best way to serve your advertisers. What about our shareholders? What do we owe them? These individuals, and now of course increasingly institutions, have invested their dollars in our company for one reason: to achieve a superior return on their investment through dividends or stock price appreciation. This would seem to pose a conflict between journalistic quality, which is expensive, and maximum profits, which drive up the stock price. But I believe the conflict is more illusory than real. When the Washington Post Company first went public in 1971, the investment community was skeptical. They viewed me as a crazy liberal woman who was only interested in journalistic issues. To convince them otherwise, that I also cared about profits, which God knows I do, I invented a saying when talking to analysts that has since become a bromide. I told them quality and profitability go hand in hand, and it turns out to be true. We found over the years that investments in quality ultimately pay off. They may not pay off immediately in terms of ad pages or readers, but few investments do. For example, just one foreign correspondent with the necessary support system can cost as much as $300,000 a year. It's arguable whether it produces more than a few readers or a single page of advertising. And yet it is this kind of investment that has earned our publications and others their place in the market, their audience, and ultimately their financial success. At the same time, I believe in rigorous management and cost control. I deplore waste and fat, and many media companies had become pretty bloated over the years before the recent and much-needed rounds of belt-tightening took place. We all are always looking for new and more efficient ways of doing our jobs better. Now let's turn to our readers. What do we owe them? Like doctors whose first rule is to do no harm, our first rule is to tell no lies, to print the facts as best we can determine them. I deliberately did not say truth. Walter Lippmann said, if we assume that news and truth are two words for the same thing, we shall, I believe, arrive nowhere. News and truth are not the same thing and must be clearly distinguished. In my experience, the truth is a very elusive commodity that emerges only over a period of time and through many publications and through many stories. If we aim to report the facts, give perspective, and offer opinion, clearly labeled, we'll have our hands full. Beyond that, the needs of the audience vary greatly according to the publication and its particular role. Although its impact is national and international, the Washington Post functions in many ways like most dailies, unlike, say, the New York Times, which is different. It reaches a relatively small upper crust segment of a very large marketplace with many, many readers. And it's also distributed nationally. The Washington Post is a mass communication vehicle for a local area. The Post reaches 55% of our area's households daily and 74% on Sunday, the highest penetration of any major market paper. Average major market penetration is 23% daily and 30% on Sunday. As a mass medium, the Post has to appeal to a group of people whose income, education, and interests are vastly different. We have to appeal to the expert on an arcane subject and to his next-door neighbor who knows little about it and cares less. Our location in Washington brings special obligations. Not only is the Post trying to report on the city of Washington and several surrounding jurisdictions, each with its own government, courts, businesses, cultural, and social activities, but on the national government too. We are at once the political paper of record and the inter-office memo system for all branches of the federal government. It's a mind-boggling job. The White House alone used to be a handful of people who made policy. It's now a cast of hundreds and even thousands. Officials know the best way to deliver a message to the president is on the front page of the Washington Post, and believe me, they try. The responsibilities of a newsweekly magazine to its readers are different from local newspapers and from local television stations as well. The news magazine format is a very strong and vital one, I think, but it's not a franchise like a local television station or newspaper. A magazine's franchise is much more elusive and much more fragile. Changing times and reader interest can erode it. In fact, many strong magazine franchises have disappeared entirely over the years, including the Weekly Life, Look, Collier's, the Saturday Evening Post, Woman's Home Companion, all once venerable American institutions. On the other hand, there has been an increase in specialty and targeted magazines, large and small. Some 1,000 new titles were added in the past 2 years alone, ranging from Quilting USA to Pistol Power. A magazine can earn a niche in the marketplace if it provides just one kind of news, information, or entertainment that is available nowhere else. So the new news magazines face growing competition for the advertiser's dollar and for the reader's time and attention. As a result, they are redefining their role in the light of the avalanche of news now available. Newsweek is aiming to do two things. First, to fulfill its function of giving the reader a complete package each week of what happened and what lies ahead. And second, to bring readers stories that Newsweek can add to, impact stories, and stories about emerging trends and issues that can affect people's lives. Although daily newspapers and weekly news magazines have very different roles, they share a common key to success in fulfilling them. That key is a successful relationship between owners or publishers, as whatever they're called, and editors. My own view is that owners should get the very best people they can, people whose philosophy and general outlook are similar to and compatible with theirs, and give them as much autonomy as possible. I believe editors should be free to pursue the news as they see it. They should have the liberty, indeed it is their duty, to probe, question, and challenge the status quo and conventional wisdom. As someone put it long ago, to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. We do have a no surprise rule at the Post and Newsweek. If I or the present publisher of the Post, my son Don Graham, am going to be involved in a controversy, we need to be in on the takeoff as well as on the landing. It also applies to any major decision or changes in editorial policy. But it comes as something of a surprise to people when they learn that owners and publishers don't tell editors what to do. We don't protect friends from editorial inquiry, nor do we pursue those who are not friends. Some people think I can go down to the newsroom and say, go get him. I can't, I don't, and I wouldn't. While I regularly attend Newsweek story and cover meetings when I'm in New York, I don't read the magazine in advance. I get it the same time you do. And because of the independence accorded to editors, some stories appear in both the Post and Newsweek, which I may not like. However, while I believe in liberty, I don't believe editors should have written guarantees of autonomy as they have in some European papers, nor should they function without restraints, checks, or balances. I think we all need opposing or alternative voices. Instead, I believe publishers have a right to be heard, to give their opinions, and to criticize when necessary. Consequently, they need to have editorial experience, or at least to have learned to be sensitive to editorial issues. I describe the best relationship between publishers and editors as a constant conversation in which each influences the views of the other. I never dictate what should be done, what should be covered, or how, but I do voice my opinions and on occasion seek to persuade by logic and force of argument. The opinion page editor of the Post, Meg Greenfield, is in the same mold of general views as am I and the publisher. She has autonomy, but there is a constant formal and informal exchange of views. The publisher and I occasionally go to editorial board meetings at the Post, participate in the discussions, and feel free to exchange views on an informal basis. Our views are considered, but are not, I think, and that's what we want, given undue weight. At the Post, this applies to editorial endorsements as well. When the time comes for the decision, all 8 members of the editorial staff have voiced their views, as have Don and I. However, no vote is taken. Meg makes the decision, having had all our input. Don and Meg and I have always agreed, including this year, when we did not endorse either of the presidential candidates. In the event of constant disagreements of a major kind, I suppose the editor would have to or want to go elsewhere. That brings me to a final obligation. What do we owe the people, groups, and institutions on which we report? First, let me say what we don't owe them. I don't believe we owe them a piece of our publication, although many groups seem to think they are entitled to it. They act as though we have an obligation to give them a voice, cover their particular activity or cause, and portray them a certain way. Obviously, I don't believe we can ever surrender our editorial judgment and control. However, the media do have an obligation to bend over backward, to give everyone a hearing, to listen to their complaints, to try to understand their viewpoint, to redress imbalances in our coverage, and of course to correct our mistakes, which being human, we do make. Sometimes, though, it's hard to know if we are truly in the wrong. Many groups are less interested in fair coverage than in their coverage. Bias can also be in the eye of the reader. Still, we are criticized with some justification for not putting ourselves enough in the other fellow's shoes. That having been said, I do not believe we can or should be overly preoccupied with the possible impact of our reporting, even when so-called national security issues are at stake. That may sound shocking, but let me explain what I mean. Like other citizens, we in the press have no wish to endanger national security or threaten human life. We are willing and even anxious to withhold information that could have those results. We are willing to consult with government officials when the information we have is particularly sensitive. We often leave information out of our stories or kill them entirely in the interests of national security or to protect human life. At the time of the Iranian hostage crisis, for instance, Newsweek knew American hostages were hiding in the Canadian embassy in Tehran, but sat on the information for months until they escaped. But let's face it, government officials almost invariably prefer to operate in secrecy. Left to its own devices, the government classifies too much, including newspaper articles, which turn up in government files stamped top secret. Very frequently, government wants only to make its job easier, protect itself from embarrassment, or carry out a policy or program that could not win public support. So, except in the most compelling circumstances, I believe it is up to the government to keep its secrets and up to the press to print what it knows. It's a very slippery slope when we begin to concern ourselves with the consequences of our reporting by tailoring the news according to what we believe is good for the public to know. In closing, I believe that by serving our readers, advertisers, and shareholders well, and by reporting responsibly on people and institutions, we fulfill our obligations to our country and society as a whole. The media were given their great freedoms in the United States so that critical societal issues could be raised, explored, debated, and ultimately resolved in a democratic way. From the budget and trade deficits to education, from arms control to the environment, from the abuses of the powerful to the plight of the poor, the underprivileged, and the disenfranchised, the press serves as the public's eyes, ears, voice, conscience, and goad. We exist so that democracy can flourish, and the lot of people everywhere can improve. We never fulfill our responsibilities as completely or as well as we would like, but we are dedicated to the task and hope always to do our job better. Thank you. Oh, we have questions. I guess we have questions over there.
Thank you, Katharine. You've touched on a number of points that merit some questions, and I know that the audience will be preparing some. But let me start out by speaking to you as a CEO. You started your address tonight by connecting the financial strength and the commercial independence of the press with its capacity to pursue and publish the news. What challenges do you see media companies facing in the current economic environment of leveraged buyouts and worldwide consolidation of media?
I think that that many companies do feel imperiled these days, whereas they never did. Two protections used to exist: the federal communications laws, which forbid foreigners and in fact made it difficult to take over companies, and size on the big media companies. We, the New York Times and Media General, were protected by the two quality of shares, and two other big companies, Dow Jones and Times Mirror, have gone to that protection, and so have a couple of others. But there are media companies being taken over, as we know, publishing companies. And I think that with the low dollar and the European favorable exchange rate, I'm afraid I think that some of us are imperiled, and I think that's too bad.
Are there other operations that you'd like to see put in place to protect the press? Would you like to see some regulations coming back?
I really don't know enough. That's a complicated subject. The whole subject of how to prevent takeovers is so complex. Nobody quite knows how to do it.
What's going to happen to the small town local papers if this trend toward press consolidation continues? Do you have much hope for America's small papers, independent papers?
Well, most of them, they're only, I think, out of, what have we got, 1,700? I think there's 600 left that are or less that are independent. That figure may not be quite right. But most of them have been sold by families that go into the second and third generation to larger media companies. And I don't find this a concern. I think we've got enough groups and enough quality groups. And I think that some of these papers have improved. I don't think they necessarily go downhill. I'm afraid I think they're less involved locally with their community to some extent because the families don't grow up there. They run professionally. And so it's that they have that disadvantage. But I don't think there's a problem there.
Are you ready to talk about any of the other conflicts, short of those of the proportion of the Pentagon Papers and the Watergate conflict between government and the press? Have there been others recently short of those dimensions?
Yes. There are, because of the adversarial relations, they go on frequently, I must say. And our practice, when one comes up, is to go to the government and discuss it with them and listen to their arguments. And in fact, if we think it's super sensitive, there have been an instance or two where Ben Bradley has just gone out to the CIA and said, somebody's trying to set us up, we shouldn't know this, and told them what we learned and how we learned it. On the other hand, there are arguments that go on. Well, you know, you can think of any number. There was the Glomar Explorer, the submarine that, what was it? The Russians, I guess, were trying to pull up, and that the CIA was sensitive about, and I think that was a sort of contrived issue. We published a story that about the King of Jordan getting subsidies from the government, and they very much wanted us not to do that, but we did it. There was a very sort of odd battle about a satellite that went up, that a great fuss was made about. A whole press conference was held by the Pentagon saying this is going to happen and nobody should report it. I mean, it was unbelievable. And so a reporter on the paper made 2 calls and found exactly what was going to happen and why it was going to happen, and everybody knew it and it had been printed. And so we ran that one and got accused of disloyalty by Weinberger, but we didn't think it was disloyal.
Good.
So, you know, they go on all the time.
Yes. And maybe that the public may be less aware of that constant struggle because it doesn't quite hit the level of intensity as Watergate and Pentagon did. The most intense one, I guess, was the coverage of a trial of a spy in Baltimore, and there was some discussion about whether what he was being tried for should be discussed. And we did, I must say, I was at home on the bed and got a call from President Reagan one Saturday afternoon. I'm just reading the papers, and they said, the president's calling. And so I said, hello, sir. And he said I think Casey was sitting right next to him. And he told us why we shouldn't publish this. And I said, well, I really did go to the editors, and I had a good deal of sympathy with that one. They said that, yes, the Russians knew it, and the Russians had done it, but it somehow, if you published it, it would call attention to it, and it would do certain things. I mean, they had an argument. It's easier if it was cut and dried, you know. I had a good deal of sympathy with the government on that one, and we withheld some of it. But you went ahead and published the rest.
Some of it, yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask a question that citizens think about, and I know there's some editors present, and you may want to get some of their input on this. Many citizens wonder why bad news and crises occupy so much press attention and press space, and good news is harder to find. We all know that if a teacher becomes a drug dealer, that's big news. You tend less to see the stories of the teachers who make such a difference in someone's life. The same sort of stories about parents as child abusers hit the press all the time. You get my drift. Is there any data or are there any studies that confirm that bad news sells better than good news?
Well, the point about bad news is that it is news. It's not that 100 planes land safely every day that you want to hear about. It's not that it sells, it's simply that bad news is the news. Unfortunately, the cat that gets stuck in the tree is the news, not the ones that are running around on the sidewalk.
Let me.
So it's not, we're not out to sell papers over tragedies. It's unfortunately the plane that crashes that's the news.
Well, I guess the point that some citizens might suggest here is that some kinds of good news really can help to transform society. And I'm thinking particularly, for instance, of the tremendous amount of press that Eugene Lang's work in the New York City schools got. And there have been a number of copycats of Eugene Lang's work all over the nation to greater and lesser degrees in terms of dollars spent, but the impact of that press coverage served to create a ripple of that goodness throughout the nation. And I wonder whether if there were a more concerted effort to find those cats that do valiant acts in trees, we might not create more ripples of that kind of positive
outcome. I agree
outcome.
with you that I think that part of our obligation is to bring the facts of societal problems and hopefully if there's somebody who solved one or made a good crack at solving one, that you report it and certainly hope that other people will pick it up, and that's happened. But I think we're much better at reporting those things. And I think we do. I mean, the one you cite being a prime example, but there are a lot of others.
Thank you, Catherine. Let me, because there's such an enormous stack of letters here, of questions here, abandon the rest of my own and turn to the questions of our audience. The first question is, would you explain what led to the decision not to endorse a presidential candidate? Many of us had difficulty choosing, but a vote was required of each of us.
Well, we said that we certainly wanted everybody to vote, that we weren't suggesting that you don't vote. But we said that institutionally we felt we couldn't endorse this year. And the reason was because we felt that Dukakis was extremely weak on defense and foreign policy. And we laid out what our problems were with his stance. And on the other hand, we thought for the Washington Post to turn around and endorse President Bush, who had been going around trashing big L liberals all over the country, was just something we couldn't see our way to doing. Now that he's in office and has dropped some of the campaign strategies, it seems to me that he's done fine. Yeah. I mean, I think maybe we could have endorsed him if we'd known what was going to happen.
Thank you. The next question.
Sorry about that.
The next question is, do you think that the Post would receive favorable decision it did in 1971 had the Supreme Court then consisted of those justices who constitute it today?
I'm not enough of a lawyer to answer that. I think maybe we would. Yes. I think prior restraint which is the issue there, that this court would still be all right on, but there are probably lawyers here who know more than I do about that.
All right. I'm going to read this one to you without having pre-read it.
Dangerous.
Unpre-screened, this is. Are you all ready? Newsweek was almost vicious in its coverage of Quail, thank you. There's no Y. That makes it tough for those of us in languages. Quail during the elections. Although I'm not at all a fan of his, this was disturbing. Was this an editorial decision?
Well, there are 3 Newsweek editors in the audience, and they may want to answer it. But I don't think that there was certainly, I can answer the first thing, was there an editorial decision to be mean to Quail? No. It's pretty easy to be mean to Quail. I don't think we were worse than I don't think Newsweek was any tougher on him than other publications. But Rick, do you agree? All right.
Great. That's corroboration. We need it. Roger Alice told a group here that Hales. There you go. Told the group here that he tailored the Bush campaign to fit the TV network's 9-second news comments. He laid the blame for the type of campaign he led on the shoulders of the media. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's on Roger Ailes' shoulders. But the fact is that all campaigns are somewhat geared, and I think this is a great problem these days. The whole advertising campaign is geared to the 15-second spots, and that makes them very simplistic, and when they get negative, very negative. And they're geared to the evening news shows. And I think it became a great problem in the campaign this time, that this happened to such an extent that the print reporters were all but outcasts and pariahs, because the candidates didn't want to, what they call, step on their own lines. And because they wanted to deliver this night news message, they wanted a quick 30-second spot on the night news. And they wanted their message delivered that way or by the advertisements. They simply didn't talk to print. On our reporters on the Bush plane, not even the press secretary was on the press plane. And there was no access. And then Dukakis began to learn. So although he gave press conferences and talked to reporters earlier, by the time of the end of the campaign, he wasn't talking to print either.
There are a set of questions here that talk about the sorts of things that the press focuses on, and I'll ask one of them and see if we probably get to the others. Can you comment on the extent to which the press investigates or influences the careers and personal lives of major politicians? For example, Gary Hart, whose stories we heard about a great deal, versus rumors about George Bush's similar activities, perhaps. Also, how has this changed over the past 20 years since JFK?
Well,
these are wonderful questions, guys.
No, that's a fair question because it has changed. It certainly has changed. But let me go back to Bush and Hart. You cannot blame these things on the media. Gary Hart had a pattern of behavior that climaxed in this boat trip. But I mean, sorry. It was well known that after 9 o'clock at night, you couldn't find Gary Hart, and you couldn't find him much early in the morning. And this was known to the whole press, and finally they printed it. And the idea that you shouldn't print that seems to me extraordinary. Now, about Bush, that is there was a wonderful story that I love, because there was a rumor about Bush that went all over Washington, that he had, this is when he was vice president, not during the campaign, he had come out of a house at 3 in the morning, and that some shots had been fired by a security, and that he'd been discovered in the lady's house, and it really was an absolutely senseless, baseless rumor. But it got so widespread that somebody finally asked Barbara Bush what she thought of the rumor. And she said, oh no, not George. Not 3 in the morning, maybe 3 in the afternoon.
That's
But to go back to the question about has reporting changed on these events, yes. There is no question about it that there were, that frankly, I mean, just go back to Franklin Roosevelt. There was an unwritten agreement that nobody would take a picture of him in his wheelchair. And his train stopped, and he went to see his friend, and nobody said a word. I mean, he stopped the train and went to see a lady. And now this has been in print and all that. So now Kennedy, I don't know whether Miss Exner is, whether her story is true or not, but if that had been known, that would have, I'm sure, been printed. But nevertheless, he did not get a lot of ink on lady friends who were sort of known to exist, and I suppose would be written about today. I think that's true.
What's brought about the change? Why is this? Do we have different expectations?
I think that television has changed things to some extent, electronic media have, and I think that probably there is a feeling that there is some privacy, there can be some privacy, there should be some privacy, but then when people's private habits affect their public behavior, they should be published, and I think that's right.
This question takes us out of titillation and back to the press. I had the pleasure, this questioner says, of living in Washington and reading the Post on a daily basis. I found the paper both informative and enjoyable, a well-rounded newspaper. Why haven't the New York papers been able to bridge the gap between the Congressional Record and supermarket tabloids, as well as the Washington Post? I see we need you here in New York.
I don't quite know what that question means.
How come there isn't a paper in New York like the Washington Post?
Well, you see, I mean, one of the things I was trying to say was that that papers have to suit their markets. And our market is a very cohesive market, and it has some unity, even though we have our suburbs and our beltways and all that. And it's less cohesive than it was because it's growing so fast. But everybody in Maryland wants to know what Virginia thinks and what politics are going on in Virginia. And I think there is a mutuality of interest there that may not exist here because of the various boroughs. I think it's a much harder market from that point of view.
Mm-hmm. All right. This is a follow-up question in a sense. Does highlighting of opinion polls before elections have an unhealthy effect on results? How do you feel about that issue?
Well, there undoubtedly is an avalanche of polls now, but the candidates have their own polls. And I don't see why people shouldn't know what those polls say. I think they're part of the news. And I don't think there's anything wrong with publishing them. I think they're how you play them and whether you overplay them and on what page and whether you're fair and whether you try to put balance in them is all very important. But I see no reason for, unfortunately there may be too many polls, but I think that the information they bring is of value.
Do you feel the same way about the announcement of election night of what's happening in various parts of the country?
I think that the networks, I'm sure Larry Tisch is here, but
Yes.
I think that the networks have an agreement
Yes.
that they don't publish before the polls close, and I think that's right.
This question takes us in a different direction. As advice to a young woman, how do you feel about combining a career and children, and do you have special arrangements for your female employees?
Not enough. Not enough. I think that we are doing all sorts of interesting things. I think that daycare is the worst problem, and I don't think any of us have solved it, and I think it'll take a federal effort. I don't think business can solve the daycare problem. But we do give more leaves. We give paternity leaves. We have a lot of interesting things. We have a couple who have one job in Tokyo. It's a married couple, and they're sharing the job because, so that I think that we're all trying to do our best to accommodate these very different and new situations, but none of us are doing well enough.
Do you advise young women entering careers or young men entering careers on how to proceed with the combination of family and career life?
No. I think that people have to make their own decisions, and women do, and men do, on how to balance. I think it's the word. I feel very lucky that I had some serialness to my own working life, that I was at home most of the early years of my children, although not all. The people who are having children and balancing careers and homes and things, I think there's a terrible strain on people, and they have to make their own decisions whether they want to accommodate to spending time with their children when they're young, which I think many do, and therefore sacrifice to some extent the all-outness of their career. And there are others who just make the decision to work full-time and go back as soon as they can, and that I know one of our editors at Newsweek has a husband who's writing a book at home, and she has a very demanding job. She's one of the top editors, and she's just had a second baby, and she manages to balance it all, but she says that the fact that her husband's writing a book at home makes it possible. So I think every situation is so individual that you can't really advise people they have to do what they want to do.
This question, Kay, takes us back to the press and notions of freedom of press that you alluded to in your presentation. The writer says, many people say that Americans enjoy more press freedom than anyone else in the world, but others say that the need to adhere to politically or socially popular positions in order to protect the bottom line, that is the financial solvency that you mentioned, makes our corporate-dominated journalism the least free in the West. Which is it, and do we really have the freest press in the world?
I think I can answer that with an unequivocal yes. I think that the press in America is really the free. I think we've got great freedoms and great responsibilities that have to be balanced. And because of our First Amendment and the constitutional democracy under which we operate, we have much greater freedom than even in other parliamentary democracies like England, where the libel laws are very restrictive and where you can't report a court case once it's being heard. And now Mrs. Thatcher is really threatening with very restrictive press laws on certain kinds of terrorism film and what you can and can't show. So I think that we certainly do have the freest press, and I think that we use it freely and responsibly, and I think on the whole, I think the press, the people who are responsible for the press in this country are very conscious of that.
That was a question that I had planned to ask you, in fact, about how the press can be manipulated and is manipulated. Sit-ins and demonstrations are ways of often not only of getting to the people who are around that issue immediately, locally, but also getting national press attention if there's enough activity around it. In the same way we've seen in government circles, photo opportunities, that is, planned and staged events that are very different from a news conference where a person is making him or herself available to open questioning. A photo opportunity is a closed and staged event. So one question would be, how does the press protect itself from what really amounts to a kind of vandalism of its pages by individuals or groups who take over or try to take over, even terrorists and kidnappers who then try to get attention? What are the mechanisms?
This is a constant problem, and I think that you have to meet each case as it arises, and you have to, I mean, sometimes you have to, people use you in all kinds of ways, and sometimes you want to be used, but you say, you know, this person is trying to use us, kind of, this is their ways of saying it. And you have to balance it. I mean, I remember this issue, I suppose, arose most keenly and has continued to arise since the demonstrations, the civil rights demonstrations and the Vietnam War demonstrations, how to cover these riots or urban situations. I mean, everybody wants television coverage, and that's a particularly delicate and difficult thing to handle, and you have to sort of handle your lights and not attract attention and not use it if you don't think it's right. But you also weigh things. I mean, if people are using chicken blood in front of the Dow chemical plant, you can forget it. But if the monk is burning himself, you have to take it. That's a message you take seriously. I mean, it's a tough issue to handle, but you have to do the best you can.
There aren't policies then that editors arrive at ahead of time as to how they're going to deal with it. Are there guidelines that editors use?
I mean,
can you describe them?
Well, particularly in the case of terrorism, I think that we learn, unfortunately, with every one of these passing incidents. I think that with the TWA plane, people learned, you know, that you can't let them use you. You can't put them on the air directly. You have to watch out for competition. Now, that's easier said than done, because once one of these things starts, then everybody gets very competitive. But I think that there's a sense of what you do and don't do in these terrorist things that is growing, and that the responsibility, and just you'd have to unfortunately learn, but I think we're learning.
Mm-hmm. There's a question that follows along the same sort of approach, and I'll ask it, and you can see if you want to comment on it. How do you view the media's handling of the Tawana Brawley incident?
I don't think I can answer that, because that's a sort of editorial question, and I think it was probably a greater editorial question here than in the other parts of the country. That was an awfully tough case to handle with all those sensitivities, but maybe some editor here can answer that. I don't think I can. This is Rick Smith, the editor of Newsweek. The editor, thank you, Rick. Is Lou Bacardi, the editor of the AP, is here. Do you have anything to add, Lou, or are you still here? Did you fink out? Thank you, Lynn.
Yes?
Just to follow up for a second, I think one of the extraordinary things about being an editor and being in journalism is to watch a story like this unfold and to watch and listen to the conversations that we have in our own news organizations about how we would have handled that case, how would we handle a similar one in the future. Just as Kay mentioned on the terrorism issue, you learn from each one of these things. The fact is the world changes at such a rate, you're presented with a new challenge every day and every week. But please don't think that we don't look at these cases, put ourselves in the shoes of other editors and other producers, and ask ourselves how do we handle that situation, and keep those issues in mind when new cases come up. It's just as we have a constant conversation about the editing of a magazine or a newspaper, within the news organizations there's a constant conversation about how to handle these tough cases.
Thanks very much.
Helpful, thank you, Rick.
This next question goes back to some of the financial issues that we talked about. The writer says, I think it's a disgrace that publications totally bastardize their editorial content for advertisers' sake.
Come again?
That is, Newsweek writing a fitness editorial to get fitness advertisers. I think publications, especially magazines, are being ruled by advertisers. How can we stop or avoid this? I want to publish a magazine that is of interest to people, not advertisers. Help.
I don't want to answer that. It's not true. I mean, in fact, no reputable publication is influenced by its advertisers, and occasionally you lose one. But I must say that there's a remarkable degree of understanding and tolerance between advertising and editorial, and they understand that the best medium for advertising is the most credible and the most readable. And so they're going to go along with something they may not like, and they usually do.
Excuse me, the New York Times was influenced by advertisers when it fired Sidney Schanberg, who exposed the waterfront and the real estate interests involved in the sale of land along the Hudson River. So the New York Times at that time was influenced by advertisers.
I don't know whether there's any, but I just doubt that. I mean, I understand about the Schanberg problem, and I wish the New York Times were here, but I can't answer that. But I doubt very much that it was advertising.
Another question focuses on another newspaper. Would you care to comment on the great change in appearance of the Christian Science Monitor?
Well, I haven't seen it, to be honest. I don't see the Christian Science Monitor, but look, they were losing a ton of money. And I suppose they thought they wanted to put their money in broadcasting and to save it. And of course, Kay Fanning and their top editors resigned over this issue. And so I suppose that they were distressed. But I think when you're losing, what was it, $17 million a year, I can understand having to rethink that problem.
Thank you. The next question says, has the press become sloppy about letting government officials use it, as you mentioned it, as an inter-office memo, as individual reporters pursue power and notoriety or celebrity that accompany a news scoop?
Have you stopped beating your wife? That it doesn't happen. The press is used by government in strange ways. One of the preeminent ones is off-the-record press conferences and off-the-record press briefings. Like Kissinger used to stand in the back of his plane and do backgrounders, and so all the papers would carry a government spokesman said, and of course everybody in government knew. The only people who were baffled were the readers. And there are just innumerable things like this that happen. There's the Sperling breakfast, there are all these briefings by people who want to be either on background or off the record. And we tried, because we thought that we were being used, and the Post tried not going to them. And I must say, and we also put Kissinger on the record by just quoting him. And finally, he did go on the record. We pushed him on the record on those things. But we tried doing without the off-the-record press briefings with the anonymous spokesman, whom all tea leaf readers knew, but non-tea leaf readers didn't know. And we found the reporters needed those press conferences and wanted to go to them and had to use them. And so we do our best to describe who's speaking and why they're speaking and why they're doing what they're doing and to whom they're doing it to. And we try to put that in the story. But I mean, the idea that reporters are rushing in and stealing papers or printing stuff is just nonsense.
I have one question before the last one, all right? This questioner says, in your recent visit to North Africa, what are your impressions of that area, and which leader impressed you most? Finally, what lies ahead for U.S. diplomacy? That's a Henry Kissinger question. Remember the three-part questions, and he could remember them backwards? Let me assume that I should ask them to you individually. What are your impressions of North Africa gleaned from your recent visit?
Well, it was a whole year ago, so it's not that recent, and the riots have taken place in Algeria since then. And it clearly does have large economic problems. I was in Algeria and Tunisia, and in Tunisia, Ben Ali certainly was an interesting leader, the new president. And I thought he was extremely promising. I think that there's a fundamentalist problem there, and in many parts of that part of the world that is extremely difficult, and I think he's doing his best to try to manage it, and I think he's doing very well. But it's a great threat to that part of the world, I think.
Do you have any comments on what you think lies ahead for U.S. diplomacy with that area?
With North Africa? No.
The last question, I'm sure you've been asked many times, but since most of us here are over the age of 16, we'll all know just what it means. Do you know who was Deep Throat?
No, I don't.
Katharine Graham, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.